A British fleet strong enough to end the revolution in one afternoon sailed south. Waiting for them was a navy built from green timber in barely 2 months. In the winter of 1775, 2 American columns marched north through brutal wilderness, attempting a desperate invasion of British-held Quebec before winter fully set in. One column was led by Benedict Arnold, a restless Connecticut merchant captain with no formal military training, but years of hard-earned experience commanding ships at sea. Months earlier, Arnold had helped capture a key British fort through a bold surprise assault, establishing his reputation as aggressive to the point of recklessness. On the final night of 1775, American forces launched a desperate assault on Quebec's fortified walls during a raging blizzard. The attack collapsed into disaster. Arnold took a musket ball to the leg early in the fighting, but refused to leave until physically carried off. The assault ultimately failed completely. By spring 1776, surviving American forces retreated south, ravaged by smallpox and exhaustion, pulling back toward a series of forts along a critical waterway. That waterway was Lake Champlain, stretching over 100 miles between Canada and New York, forming a natural highway that could split the colonies in half. Every officer on both sides understood the stakes. Whoever controlled this corridor controlled whether the American colonies stood united or were cut irreparably apart. At a war council that July, Arnold proposed something that sounded almost absurd to the officers present: build a navy from nothing in a matter of weeks. Not a real navy in any traditional sense, but a fleet of small, flat-bottomed gunboats built specifically for the shallow, unpredictable waters of Lake Champlain. Arnold was sent to a small settlement at the lake's southern end, home to sawmills and an iron forge, capable of producing exactly the materials needed. Calls went out across 3 colonies. Ship carpenters arrived by the dozens, joined by ordinary soldiers who had never touched a shipbuilding tool in their lives. The operation was chaotic from the start. Smallpox and malaria tore through the workforce. Supplies arrived late, damaged, or not at all. Morale collapsed repeatedly. Arnold drove the work forward with relentless personal energy, overseeing ship designs directly and traveling constantly to secure supplies the Army had failed to deliver. The primary vessel built was a squat, flat-bottomed gunboat, roughly 50 feet long, ugly by any standard, but capable of carrying cannons and floating reliably. By early October 1776, Arnold had assembled 16 vessels total, roughly 650 men strong. Most taught basic seamanship in a matter of weeks. Many of these men had never set foot on a ship before, let alone fired a cannon from a rolling deck. They had almost no formal naval training whatsoever. The British, meanwhile, had spent that same summer building something far more formidable at their own shipyard north of the lake, with resources America simply couldn't match. British engineers dismantled entire warships at Quebec, hauled the pieces overland through muddy forest roads, and reassembled them completely from the keel up. The most formidable of these ships alone carried 18 heavy cannons, rebuilt in under a month, a single vessel more powerful than Arnold's entire fleet combined. When the British commander finally set sail that October, his combined force included roughly 25 warships and 400 transport vessels carrying nearly 10,000 men. Arnold knew with absolute certainty he could not win an open water battle. So he chose ground that would neutralize almost every British advantage entirely. He anchored his entire fleet in a narrow channel behind an island, arranging his ships in a crescent formation where the British could only attack a few at a time. His own second-in-command argued fiercely for retreat instead. Arnold overruled him, insisting his inexperienced crews could aim and fire far more reliably than maneuver. On the morning of October 11th, the British fleet sailed past the island, completely unaware, its dense tree line hiding Arnold's entire fleet from view. Around 10 that morning, British lookouts finally spotted masts poking above the trees. The British commander immediately ordered his fleet to turn and attack. Strong headwinds that had pushed the British south now worked directly against them, leaving their most powerful warship stranded out of effective range for hours. Arnold sent his fastest ships forward as bait, deliberately drawing British vessels deeper into the narrow channel where his crescent formation waited patiently. The bait ship took heavy fire while withdrawing, lost control in the tricky winds, and ran aground, eventually set ablaze by pursuing British boarding parties. For the next several hours, both fleets hammered each other at close range within that narrow channel, in some of the loudest, most brutal fighting of the war. Arnold personally moved from gun to gun aboard his flagship, directing fire and shouting orders through the thick smoke covering the deck of his battered vessel. Cannonballs punched through wooden hulls, sending clouds of splinters flying like shrapnel. Masts shattered. Men were killed at their guns and immediately replaced. One American gunboat took a heavy cannonball below the waterline and sank within the hour, going straight to the bottom with the fatal shot still lodged in her hull. By late afternoon, the most powerful British warship finally fought her way close enough to unleash devastating broadsides that tore apart what remained of the American line. When darkness finally ended the fighting, the American fleet was wrecked. Nearly 80 men were dead or wounded, with most of their ammunition already exhausted. British warships formed a blockade across the channel's southern exit, confident they had the entire American fleet trapped and ready for capture at first light. That evening, Arnold gathered his surviving captains and revealed an audacious plan. They would attempt to slip through the British blockade under cover of darkness. Each ship would follow a single shielded lantern, oars muffled with rags, threading silently through a narrow gap in the British line under thick, moonless fog. By dawn, the British discovered the channel completely empty. The entire American fleet had vanished during the night, slipping past them undetected in the fog. But unfavorable winds slowed the retreating Americans, and within 2 days, the fastest British warships caught up, pouring sustained cannon fire into Arnold's rear guard. Nearly out of ammunition and unable to escape further, Arnold made his final decision. Running his remaining ships ashore in a shallow bay British warships couldn't follow. Arnold ordered every wounded man pulled off first, then set his remaining vessels ablaze, deliberately leaving their flags flying as a final act of open defiance. As his ships burned, Arnold marched roughly 200 exhausted, wounded survivors overland through dense forests, reaching safety at a fort still held by American forces. The British fleet finally arrived at the abandoned American position days later, greeted only by smoking ruins and the first snowfall of an early, harsh winter. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, the British commander hesitated, pushing scouts forward, but ultimately deciding against a final assault before winter fully arrived. By early November, the entire British invasion force withdrew north toward Canada to establish winter quarters, effectively ending the campaign season entirely. That winter, the Continental Army used the unexpected time to reinforce its positions, recruit fresh troops, and stockpile supplies for whatever came next. When British forces returned the following year under new command, they marched into a defensive position that was fully prepared and waiting for them this time. That campaign culminated in a decisive battle fought over several weeks that autumn, widely considered the true turning point of the entire Revolutionary War. Arnold himself fought there with the same ferocious energy shown a year earlier, charging into the thickest fighting before another wound shattered his leg completely. That decisive victory convinced France the Americans could genuinely win, and France formally entered the war soon after, an alliance that ultimately changed everything. A century later, a respected naval historian looked back and offered perhaps the finest summary ever written about what had truly been accomplished that October afternoon. One sunken gunboat from that battle rested undisturbed at the bottom of the lake for over 150 years, forgotten beneath the water entirely. In 1935, a salvage engineer located and raised the vessel intact. The cannonball that had sunk her still lodged exactly where it struck all those years earlier. For decades afterward, the recovered ship traveled around the region on public display, eventually finding a permanent home at one of America's premier museums. Today, it remains the oldest surviving American warship in existence, a modest wooden vessel that embodies exactly what the Revolution looked like when it was closest to failing. Desperate, improvised, badly outgunned, and built by men who had never constructed a ship before, that fleet gave the Revolution exactly what it needed most. Time, a single desperate season, bought entirely with green timber, crude iron, and men who barely knew how to sail, but refused to simply let Britain pass. A homemade fleet, built from forest timber in barely 2 months, held off the most powerful navy on earth, long enough to buy the Revolution 1 more year. And that single year changed everything that came after. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments which moment in history you want us to cover next.